So, hello and welcome to a special interview for VIT Today. We have with us Mr. Karan Thapar, a renowned journalist and a TV presenter. So, he's been on television as a renowned journalist for over 3 decades, and it's a pleasure to have you on the show, sir. We want to start this interview by talking about your take on journalism in general today. We see a shifting trend from a print platform to an online platform, and you have been actively involved in that conversion from the print platform to an online platform. Where do you see this online presence of journalism, like in the form of the wire, the print, the political, going ahead in the future?
Well, I think websites like The Wire, print, will certainly have a good run for their money as long as mainstream media continues to lack credibility, impartiality, objectivity. Most importantly of all, as long as mainstream media shies away or is unable to criticize the government fairly and objectively, then you will find that websites like The Print or The Wire will acquire a credibility that has come to them because alternative sources of information are missing. And the weaker television news channels become, the more they lose credibility. The weaker newspapers become, the more they lose credibility. The more you will find websites like The Wire strengthening.
Right, sir. So, going a little deeper into that, Mr. Obama said that if you're watching Fox News, then you and I live in a very different universe. Taking that as context, now, what is your take on the bias that exists in journalism right now and the polarity at which news is presented to two different sects of people, so to say, in the country? And how do you think that affects the integrity of the profession?
I don't think I completely agree with Barack Obama's point, or at any rate, I'm not sure. I think it's a very valid point to make, even if you agree with it. Look, in the Western world, unlike our own, it is quite normal for newspapers and television channels to be identified with a particular political ideology. So, to take the example of Britain, a country I know best, the British paper, The Telegraph, is identified with the Conservative Party. The Guardian tends to be identified with the Labour Party. The Independent, in the days when it existed as a paper, now it doesn't, it exists more as a website, was identified with the Social Democrats. The Scottish paper, The Scotsman, is identified with the Scottish Nationalists, and so it goes across the board. And it's well known that these papers, in their editorials, in their opinion pieces, will reflect the ideology that they support. But it doesn't mean to say that the media has become biased or the media lacks objectivity, because if you want a different viewpoint, you go to another paper. Similarly, if you don't like the viewpoint of Fox News, don't go to Fox News. There's no compulsion to have to watch it. There are other American channels that are very different, that offer an alternative viewpoint and assessment. Sometimes they offer alternative facts as well. Go to those if you prefer. Freedom of expression means that you have the right to express your opinion, and some papers will do it from A standpoint and others from B standpoint. As long as there is that heterogeneity, as long as there is that mixture of opinions, as long as all opinions are available, there is no problem with one paper identifying or one channel identifying with any one view.
Right, sir. Sir, another very important aspect of the very fourth pillar of democracy is censorship to a certain extent, where censorship effectively takes form in multiple ways. It could be via pressure from private organizations, the government, or an influential person with a good reach to the public. So, how do you suppose in a structure where media houses are heavily dependent on these individuals, we can reduce or perhaps tackle censorship in media that we see, sir?
Well, I don't think censorship in the media is acceptable, except for some very simple, clear-cut reasons. Libel is one of them. I think when you are libeling someone and you are in danger of a legal process that could be one that ends with your being found guilty of defamation, I think there it is important for your sake and for your paper that you be very careful. And if you're erring on the wrong side, then you cover yourself with language like allegedly, reportedly. Also, remember, if you're not sure of a fact, but you do believe it's true or it's being suggested, even if it's not confirmed, the word allegedly is the correct word to use, because it's not just a question of libel, it's also a question of conveying the wrong impression. we frequently refer to politicians as people who are criminals. Actually, until they're convicted, they're not. So what you need to say is alleged, accused or alleged X, not that they are in fact convicts, because they're not. It's important, therefore, not just in terms of libel, but it's important also in terms of getting the facts right, not giving a distorted opinion. But beyond that, I do think it is wrong to censor, unless, of course, you are being gratuitously offensive and hurtful. That is no duty of journalism. It may be the truth, but there are a lot that is unnecessary. So, for instance, if someone's parents are dying of whatever illness, there is no need to make it public to the world. That is a form of self-censorship you impose upon yourself for reasons of decorum, dignity, for reasons of courtesy and kindness. Those are equally important because I think they reflect human values. But beyond that, facts which are true and which are not libelous and which do not needlessly offend and hurt and invade people's privacy. And that's the important thing about offending and hurting. Invading unnecessarily and wrongly people's privacy, those should be known. But remember, there is a way in which you make facts known. If the object is to simply sensationalize and create a sleazy impression of someone, I'm not in favor of it, and I would say it ought to be amended. Whether you call that amendment censorship or not is a question of what choice of language you prefer.
Right, sir. So my next question focuses a bit on the social construct of a country, right? In status quo, we see that influential people in our country, may it be a politician, a sports personality, or a Bollywood superstar, are deemed extremely important in our country in the sense that whatever they say is taken sometimes even in the literal sense. The Western counterparts, as you see actors taking up important social issues like Emma Watson advocating for he for she, or DiCaprio giving his speech on climate change. These are extremely symbolic gestures. Why do you think this sense of responsibility lacks in the so-called influential people in our country? And not taking away from the fact that at an earlier, like in the 70s and 80s, you did see people like Mr. Bachchan getting standing for elections, and then you see now that people they revolt even from making a political statement. Why do you think that contrast lies in our country now?
Well, first of all, it's not compulsory for anyone who is not a politician to make a political statement. You may believe that you don't wish for your political views to be known. You have a right to keep your views private. There's no reason to have to share them. I, for instance, am not on Twitter. I feel no compulsion why I should have to comment on anything or everything happening in the country. There is a time and place to make my views known, and when I want to, I will, and when I don't, I won't. And I see no reason why every time there is an event, I should have to inform the world what I think on Twitter. I don't think the world is interested in what I have to say, frankly. And frankly, I don't think I have things to say most of the time that are that important that should be brought to people's attention. So there is no compulsion to have to speak on any or every political development, and silence or reluctance to speak is as much your right as the opposite. However, there is a different point I think you're making, which is that why do celebrities in India, even when they feel strongly, and that codicil is very important, still not express themselves? Well, I assume you're correct that there are celebrities who feel strongly who've yet deliberately kept silent. And in that case, it can only be because they fear the repercussions of speaking out. Ours is a country, a system, perhaps sometimes a government that is vengeful against those whose views they don't like or whose views are critical. But I go back to my original position. There is no duty or compulsion to speak. Silence is as respectful and to be equally honored as willingness to express.
Right, so completely understanding that argument. But if I were to argue against that, in our country, when a certain amount of importance is given to you, that comes with a certain amount of responsibility as well, right? So in the South, where you see politicians are worshipped to an extent where you put their pictures next to your gods in the mandir, right? Taking that as an example, that any statement that you make in the public does affect the mentality of the people who look up to you that much, and that comes with a certain amount of responsibility, irrespective of you withholding your own point of view in certain matters. So, do you think that that responsibility lacks in our country?
Well, it depends upon what person you're talking about. Politicians are in the business of expressing political opinions. If they keep silent on contentious issues, it is ducking it. It is not respectful silence. It's simply cowardice or not willing to share their opinion. It's a different matter, therefore, one is a politician. But you began this discussion by talking about celebrities, sportsmen, and actors. Frankly speaking, why should I care what Amitabh Bachchan thinks about a political subject? He's no better informed than I am. He has no greater capacity to speak on that subject than I do, or you do, or anyone else. He's just an actor. Let him stick to what he is good at, speak on that. There's no earthly reason why he or Sachin Tendulkar or Virat Kohli should be commenting on other things on which they have very little knowledge, probably no expertise, perhaps no understanding, certainly no great experience. Just because they're famous sportsmen or actors doesn't mean to say that their opinion on other subjects should be important for us to know. We, in a sense, cheapen discourse by giving importance to the view of a man who knows nothing about the subject just because he is an actor or he is a sportsman. So what? Who cares what Virat Kohli or Amitabh Bachchan think about whatever it is? It's not going to make a big difference to me. They're not experts, they're not scientists, they're not sociologists, they're not people who thought deeply about it. They're just famous because one guy hits a ball with a bat rather well, the other emotes on screen rather well. That doesn't give them any great qualification to talk about politics or sociology or philosophy. Why should I care about their views on that subject? And frankly, when the media thrusts it down, if it's an interesting view, then that view becomes interesting because it's an interesting view, not because of who delivered it. But just because they are important sportsmen doesn't mean to say I want to know what they have to say.
Right, sir. Sir, yes, sir. So there have been, some efforts in the past couple of years, mainly from online news sources, to make news ad-free and ad-independent in an effort to guarantee untainted news reporting accountable directly to the public than the advisors. I think that this kind of a model is in the long run a sustainable model here in the country of India.
We're asking two different questions combined in one, so let's pluck them apart. The reason why some people feel you need a model for news channels that is not dependent upon advertising is because you want to ensure that the quality of news and the manner in which news is treated is not designed to attract eyeballs, to build up TRPs and thus acquire advertising. That drives the market down. It ensures for sensationalism and more entertainment rather than factual, substantive understanding. So that's to do with the model. However, you're also talking about whether this will appeal to the audience. Well, it does in many other countries. The best news channel in the world by far, and I mean that by far, is the BBC, right? It's heads and shoulders above anything in India. And frankly, there are very few competitors in America. And it is funded by the government, but it is run autonomously and independently. And the greatest proof that the BBC is independent is that successive governments are always upset with the BBC and always threatening to revoke its charter or cut its funding. Boris Johnson is doing that now. Hopefully he won't succeed. Tony Blair threatened that when he was there, particularly during the Iraq War. He did not succeed. Mrs. Thatcher, to go back to the 70s and 80s, had much the same grouse. This has been part of the tradition of the BBC that it guarantees its independence by ensuring that there is no government in Britain that actually likes what the BBC does. They become very different, by the way, when they cease being governments and become opposition. And I would say what gives the BBC its strength, and I'm talking about the BBC in England, not what you see here, because that's not the real BBC, is the fact that it doesn't have to chase advertising, and therefore it doesn't have to popularize, sensationalize, and drive down its news to acquire viewership, right? Obviously, BBC entertainment programs are in competition with other channels' entertainment programs, and they have to ensure that they have high viewership to justify the millions of pounds spent on them. But that's a different genre of programming. That's entertainment. I'm talking about BBC News, and in particular BBC News 24, which is their 24-hour news channel. BBC World, just to explain, is certainly driven by advertising, but what BBC World is doing is simply recycling what BBC in England shows. And this channel was set up by the BBC, not with British government money, but with the BBC's own resources, which have been kept aside, and therefore they take advertising. But the news content is from BBC in England, which is why it's guaranteed to be fair, impartial, proper, objective, whatever.
Right, sir. So our next question is pertaining to something you even wrote about in your book, the encounter with the interview that you had with Mr. Modi. Could you perhaps give us an insight? I know we're short of time, but perhaps give us a small insight into what exactly happened. It'll be really great to hear it from you.
It's a very long story. I can't possibly give you a small insight into what happened. Ask me a specific question and I'll answer it. But you're basically asking me to repeat the content of that entire chapter, and it's very difficult to do.
Right, sir. So
ask me
then
a
I'll be a little
question and I'll happily answer it.
Right, sir. So I'll ask you something specific. How do you deal with the aftermath in the last 2 years? You spoke widely about how that interview affected your career as a journalist. How do you deal with the aftermath of what happened after the post the interview with Mr. Narendra Modi, with him coming into power?
Well, I've never met Mr. Modi since the interview happened, and the interview happened roughly 13 years ago. It was October 2007. It'll be 13 years in a couple of months' time. We've never met at all. After he became Prime Minister, I have asked him several times, countless number of times, in fact, for interviews, and he's simply never responded to the letters, full stop. It's quite clear that Mr. Modi doesn't consider me someone that he wishes to maintain a journalistic stroke politician relationship with. That's his prerogative and right. I've got on with my life. Mr. Modi and his government have made it clear to practically every television channel that they would not deal with that channel if I was to be making programs for that channel. That's his way of handling this. And obviously, it's quite clear that I don't approve of it, and I don't think it's a sensible, democratic way for a government to behave. It's a vengeful and, I would add, wicked way, but that is his prerogative again. I've got on with my life. I write newspaper columns for the Hindustan Times, the Business Standard, and occasionally for other papers like the Asian Age, the Hindu, the Indian Express, the Tribune. I do a lot of interviewing for The Wire. I have a company that makes, it's a production house. We make programs for whoever will take them. My own personal association as a face and interviewer is, however, with The Wire almost entirely. So you get on with life. There's no use, moaning over what's happened. You've got to get on with it.
Right, sir. So before I ask my last question, I have a special question right from Mr. Rajdeep sir this side. We interviewed him a couple of hours back, and I asked him specifically what would you ask Mr. Karan Thapar after the Independence Day speech. So he asked me to ask you, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said, ask Mr. Karan Thapar, where does Mr. Karan Thapar stand on the New India? You've written about it. You've written in your book widely about your association to England and your
my association with whom?
Your association to London.
With whom?
Your association to the United Kingdom, and seeing that growing intolerance in our country and a more, I wouldn't like to label it, but the status quo in our country is much different than it was 20 years back. And where does Mr. Karan Thapar stand, or somebody like Mr. Karan Thapar stand on what's happening in India today?
Well, why don't you tell me first what's happening in India today? Explain to me what it is that you think is happening, and I'll tell you where I stand on it. But when you simply say what's happening in India today without defining what you're talking about, I don't know what you're referring to. I don't think Rajdeep does either, frankly. What is happening in India today? Are you talking about the fact that we have a pandemic that is clearly raging out of control, and where India is fast becoming the third biggest carrier of this disease? Undoubtedly, we take a lot of comfort from our low mortality rate, but that's about the only thing, and who knows how accurately that's accounted for. Are you talking about the economic crisis? Are you talking about the problem with China? I'm not sure what you mean about what's happening in India today. Spell it out and I'll happily answer.
So I was referring to the growing intolerance to acceptance of secularism and expressing your views in our country. In the
I
sense
think
that,
Rajdeep knows, and you know, let me tell you, I think what is happening in India today, if you're talking about the intolerance, is shameful, despicable. It's something that we should be deeply upset and angry about. This is not the country I was born into. And let me be honest with you. It's not just intolerance as a general term that is growing, but within that intolerance, I do believe that there is an increasing anti-Islamic flavor in our country. We are becoming antithetical to Muslims. We don't hide it. We even exhibit it. We somehow take pride in displaying it. We like to label them as anti-nationals. We, as a term of criticism, say to people we disagree with, go to Pakistan. I find that not just hateful, but it's not the India I was born into and that I love. I don't think these are Hindu qualities. I don't think they are Indian qualities. I think the attempt to define Hinduism and its rich thought and its attitude of tolerance as if it's the opposite of Islam and therefore we have to acquire the rigidities of Islam or any other Semitic faith is wrong, it's mistaken. It fails to understand who we are, and we are foolishly trying to become what we, in fact, deliberately did not wish to be at independence: fanatical, intolerant, hateful of other religions. We are a secular country where every faith is equal, where every person has the right to his views. But whether you look at the government's attitude or the BJP's attitude or the wider RSS attitude, sometimes whether you look at the way courts behave, we are narrowing ourselves and fashioning ourselves as fanatics, easy to take offense, unwilling to listen to criticism, and constantly sensing conspiracies where clearly there are none. I find that deeply depressing. If that's what you meant by what's happening to India, clearly it's not something I hope will continue. I passionately hope it will reverse. It's not something that I applaud. It's something that I find, and I use that word deliberately, shameful. It's shaming.
right, so so on that note, I'll ask you my last question for this interview. The Prime Minister Modi delivered his speech today for the Independence Day speech. Do you have any do you have any analysis on that speech? Any good points? Any bad points? Did you enjoy the speech? Do you think it was objective enough? Did it answer the questions that are extremely relevant to our country? The COVID crisis, the border crisis, the economic crisis. Do you think it answered the questions? What is your take on the speech,
No,
essentially?
the mere fact that you asked me those questions suggests that it didn't answer those questions, and clearly it did not. Let me tell you, in a nutshell, what I thought of the speech. It was hugely long. I'm told it was perhaps the longest speech he's ever given on Independence Day. Apparently, it was just over 100 minutes. It was extremely dull. It was hard to keep awake as he was delivering it. And frankly, I didn't think it was a scintillating performance at all. And towards the end, not only did it seem to me as if the Prime Minister was acting, I think he was actually putting on an act. So frankly, it was a speech that left me unimpressed. I'll be honest with you, utterly unimpressed. And I know, so in fairness, I add this, that this is a particularly difficult year for the Prime Minister to speak, because the vaunting, ambitious, lofty sentiments that normally are expressed might have felt out of place given the multiple crises we face. But this long litany of achievements, sometimes pedestrian and often rather unworthy of special mention on a day like this. They're not unimportant, but they're just unworthy of mention on a day like this, ranging from the availability of sanitary pads through to Jan Dhan accounts, through to great pride in how many people who lost jobs because of his lockdown and had to trudge back hundreds, if not thousands of miles on their feet to their villages were then fed. He made a point of saying 80 crore more than any other country's ever fed. I think that litany of small achievements is unbecoming on Independence Day. I know the normal, lofty, soaring, ambitious rhetoric is also out of place on this particular Independence Day. But therefore, I think the solution would have been a much shorter speech, 20, 30 minutes, addressing the key concern everyone faces, that we are a country at the moment going through a crisis created because of Corona, which looks prima facie as if it's raging and we don't have control over it. And there's a lot the PM could have said there that would be reassuring, that would have put things in context. About the economy, a second crisis, and about our borders. And I know you may not want to talk about China directly, but you can still talk about our relationship with our neighbors, our commitment to peace, how we will defend ourselves. And he did briefly, let's be honest, mention it, but very, very briefly. I think if he limited himself to 20, 30 minutes and sought to address the sense of unease and concern that we all feel, the fact that suddenly the country feels uncertain and unsure, and if he'd addressed that, it would have had a much bigger impact. He'd have connected more with people. So yes, it was a very unimpressive performance. Almost towards the end, like a ham actor, somewhat overwhelmed by his own performance.
Right, sir. So on that note, I want to thank you from my entire team's end for giving us time this afternoon and conversing with us, the students. And thank you so much for all your views and your opinion. I hope we can do this again whenever you're free. And I hope you have a good Independence Day.